Hello, everyone. I'm Alejandro from Say Labs. Oh, this is not great. Anyways, I'll take you through it. So yeah, I'm Alejandro from Say Labs, and I'm going to be talking about consensus in the era of low latency. First, let's set a bit of the foundations. What's the state of consensus at the moment? Where do we come from? This is not showing at all the same thing that I'm seeing here. But anyways, so basically, I like to see consensus evolution as 5 generations. First, we have the beginning of consensus with classical consensus protocols like PBFT. Then first generation starts with Bitcoin, where we finally have some civil-resistant mechanism to have an open system for consensus. But it completely bypasses BFT consensus protocols, and the result of it is to get probabilistic finality that takes a long time and relies on asynchrony assumptions and whatnot. That's also at the time where Ethereum started, right? Then from there, we have a big change in Ethereum with proof of stake, right? Instead of relying on some time civil resistance to some real resource, we have some deposits of some virtual coin that represents the amount of power that somebody has in the system. And then an interesting key takeaway from this slide is that in generation 3, there starts happening some trade-off, right? In order to, which is embodied by Solana, right? In order to reach more users, more applications, they need to get more throughput and lower latency. And in order to get that, at the time, they traded security and decentralization. Instead of having a system that's so decentralized as Ethereum, having that as one of the primary values and primary goals, they just come up with a consensus protocol that has never really been proven correct, and much less validators, and just be a lot faster. And that is a trend that has continued for a while. It has gotten a little bit better in Solana itself as well. And there has been also some other key breakthroughs, like the decoupling of data dissemination, ordering, and execution, so that they don't happen in a sequential manner in order to increase throughput, reduce latency. But this trend of focusing on low latency has really taken the space by storm and really caused a shift in the space. And you can see that even in Ethereum. Here highlighted are some, of course, by the way, this is not a slide that represents all the possible chains, or it's kind of opinionated. But yeah, so here you have in red some of the chains that are either Ethereum 1 or rollups of Ethereum, and in blue, chains that are EVM, that are tied to Ethereum somehow, right? And in the case of Ethereum, in order to compete in this space of not so much caring about security and decentralization, but putting first throughput and latency, what they did is the rollup-centric roadmap, right? Let's just have single sequencers, but they eventually settle on-chain, and that's how we get this trade-off. And we get to compete with Solana, with others that are able to provide services that Ethereum main chain is not able to provide because of these challenges that giving a lot of decentralization, a lot of security entails. And that, on the other hand, that, on the other hand, caused a little bit of a confusion, complications in the Ethereum ecosystem, because finality became a fuzzy word, right? Consensus is there in order to provide finality, in order to provide a guarantee that everybody agrees on something and that thing will not be reverted. And it used to, in BFT chains, this is very simple, right? It's whenever super majority of the people vote on something, that is settled, that is final. But now with Ethereum and the Ethereum in the rollup-centric roadmap, we have many stages where somebody might consider finality. And it's actually growing. This year it has grown by one more with the fast confirmation rule. So imagine you have Alice that uses some neobank, which is a Web3 app, in some rollup. And this is a secret rollup. And this rollup eventually commits and settles on Ethereum. So and I'm a merchant, and Alice pays to me for some product, right? At which point do I give off my product? I could give my product when Alice pays me, right? When Alice says that she's going to pay. And that would be instant finality, right? But I get no security, right? If Alice misbehaves, I don't get paid. Or I can wait for the neobank to say, oh, Alice has sent the transaction, so you will probably get paid. And then, of course, the risk is that I'm trusting the neobank. Another stage that I can wait for is the pre-conf of the rollup, right? The rollup says, the rollup includes the transaction where Alice pays to me in the next block. But of course, that still has the risk, as Adria was saying, it's a single sequencer. I'm just trusting this rollup to eventually commit this on-chain. This is not Ethereum-level security. And this is a key point that is often forgotten, I think, nowadays, and is not talked about enough. Then I could wait for commitment, right, of the rollup state. And at that point, I start getting from 12 seconds to 12 minutes, depending on how much I wait for, increasing security, increasing probability that my transaction, that the commitment transaction that appears on-chain will not get reverted. And then after the 12, here there's a side note that with the current proposal of the fast confirmation rule, under some different assumptions like synchrony and at most 25% of the stake being controlled by an adversary, you can actually get finality, not probabilistic finality, but finality within one slot, within 12 seconds. Another thing I can do, I can wait a bit longer and eventually get off-chain finality, right? I get the finality of the commitment. So that happens at the current moment with Gasper in about 12 to 18 minutes. However, this is for the commitment. So if I want to make sure that this transaction is valid, I need to execute it myself. I need to run a full node of this rollup. So if I don't want to do that, if I'm running a light client, then I need to wait for settlement. And that imagine that in this CK rollup that happens every hour. They submit a settlement. I know some of the rollups are happening faster at the moment. Then I need to wait 1 hour and the same thing, right? Probabilistic on-chain finality, or maybe trusting synchrony and like a small stake adversary not existing in the chain to get the fast confirmation rule level of finality, or the final finality, which in this case will happen after 1 hour and 18 minutes, which is not ideal, right? Now, this is getting better, right? I already talked about the fast confirmation rule that's already being implemented by clients. It doesn't require any changes on the protocol. It hasn't been done. I'm not involved in that at all. It's some of my colleagues, some of which are the Ethereum Foundation. And yeah, so this just involves just looking at the existing information available in the network and creating a heuristic under some assumptions that give you a guarantee of finality, a guarantee that Gasper, that the finality gadget, will eventually finalize the fork that contains this transaction in that order. The assumption, as I said, is less than 25% of the stake being controlled by an adversary, and synchrony. Synchrony in the sense of if there is a message that disagrees with what I'm seeing, that message is not more than 12 seconds old. And that gives you finality in one slot. Another thing that's happened that's important in order to decrease the amount of time that it takes to get 2 rounds of voting in a finality gadget, in order to get deterministic economic security level finality, is the decoupling of the available layer epochs and the voting rounds in the finality gadget, which is also very interesting, made by my colleague Luca. And imagine, based on the publicly available information, a future where we have all of these that has been proposed, implemented in Ethereum. And let's compare it with the state of the art. And again, this is not great. OK, well, I don't know if you see anything. I think you don't see anything, do you? Do you see, OK, do you see the finality at least? OK, good. OK, well, the point is, here's like some chains that are competitors to it. Well, not competitors. Actually, I don't think any of these chains are competitors to Ethereum. Ethereum is a whole other kind of monster because of the number of validators that it has, because of the high values that it has in terms of decentralization and security. But here's some of the other L1 level chains that have decentralized consensus as well, BFT consensus, and what is the finality that they get, right? The deterministic economic security for their systems. And what you can see is in all of them, you're getting, in the case of Say, for example, where I work, we're getting like 200 milliseconds, right, for finality. So you get an economic tick every 200 milliseconds. In the case of Ethereum, in the most optimistic current scenario, it would probably take 30 to 90 seconds currently if we implemented the latest consensus proposals for Ethereum. But that's because we have 1 million validators, virtual, which hopefully gets reduced by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude. But that's still like 4 or 5 orders of magnitude more validators than any other competitor that I'm showing here. So of course, it's really hard to compete in that environment. But still, there's some interesting takeaways that we can look at from these other chains that have been really, really extremely focused on low latency and what they have been doing in order to optimize to those levels. One, which is already being looked at the peer-to-peer layer of Ethereum, is erasure or rateless coding. Right? Instead of disseminating data to everyone, sharded, well, it's actually being used also for data availability sampling. Even at the CKVM level, is now being proposed for the execution layer. Another one, I don't want to push too much for that one in this talk, although tomorrow I'm talking a bit more about that, about the benefits of that. But I think it's important. There has been proposals in Ethereum with braids, with Fossil, of having multi-concurrent proposers. And I think that's super important for MEV and censorship resistance. But yeah, it's perhaps not the time at the moment to look at in the Ethereum ecosystem. Another low-hanging fruit is pipelining consensus iterations of the finality gadget. which is also known as notarizing, the notarization threshold. A very interesting one that we are implementing at SEI at the moment, and it's also being worked at, I'm collaborating with some colleagues in Ethereum to look into these things, is in the consensus protocols, you typically have a leader that proposes a value, which is good because it gives you a synchronization point, so it reduces by a message delay the amount of rounds that you need for voting in order to get a decision and everybody agree on something. But the problem is if the leader is offline or is too slow, you lose an entire slot, right? You lose an entire timeout, and then you have to try again with a new leader. We are actually, at the moment, working into having a graceful fallback into a leaderless asynchronous protocol so that there's the main leader-based protocol that is a good case, but if the leader is offline, the leaderless protocol has already prepared an alternative. So it only takes one more message delay to actually get a decision. And even in those cases, something that could happen is that because it's leaderless, it could happen that some people vote for one value, and another was in the good case, and he voted for the value of the original leader. And in those cases, even it's actually safe to finalize the common prefix among them. So remember, this is a finality gadget, so there's a high probability of people that are proposing things to finalize propose something that may not be the same thing, there may be a fork, but there's a high likelihood of having some common prefix between them. So in that case, you can even reuse votes for different values in order to finalize the common prefix. But the one that I want to focus the most on in this talk, in the remainder of this talk, is switching to one round of voting. I don't know if you know what that is, but in BFT consensus, in order to get optimal resilience, so tolerating up to a third of Byzantine faults, you need 2 rounds of voting. And that has been the holy grail up until recently because of the pressure on low latency, because that's another message delay that it includes. And now there has been all these, actually pretty much 3 out of the 4 competitors that I showed before have switched to just having 1 round of voting, which implies a reduction in Byzantine fault tolerance from a third of participants being Byzantine to a fifth, right, 20%. This is something that is already being discussed. I can show here a post by Vitalik where he's kind of like pushing for that. And actually the quote to that tweet by Roger Wattenhofer, the head of research at ANSA, Solana, that gets a bit alarmed about this. But side note, Solana is also proposing something similar. But actually, I actually want to push for it. I actually want to say that means more economic security. So it's counterintuitive. How can it be? I also was like a bit, for me, the values of security and decentralization are very important. And I was a bit alarmed when there was this shift because of the pressure on low latency to just have a 1 round of voting and decrease Byzantine fault tolerance. But when you think about it harder, especially for the finality gadget, meaning Ethereum will always be available. The finality gadget might not generate decisions if there's a period where you have a lot of crashes, but the available chain will continue producing blocks. Whereas in Solana, if like more than 30%, if like enough nodes crash, there's just no production at all. So that's a key difference in Ethereum. The point of the finality gadget is to get economic security. And because of the nature of having 1 round of voting, meaning that you need to increase the threshold, so the number of votes that you need to wait for in order to get a decision, from 66% to 80%, it actually means that if you're smart about how you design these consensus protocols, you get an economic security increase from 33% in the current case with Casper, in the worst case, current case of Casper, to up to 60 to 80%. So 60% in the worst case with 1 round of voting, and 80% in the good case. So it's a fantastic increase in economic security, actually. And so yeah, this is the key thing that if you want to take anything away from this talk, let it be that it is not true that you need to be alarmed because of a discussion to switch to 1 round of voting in Ethereum for the finality gadget to get low latency on finality. It's actually the system where it makes the most sense because every round of voting in Ethereum is millions of validators voting. So it's an incredible saving in terms of time. And because also it's an ebb and flow protocol, so it always will be available. So the key point of the finality gadget is to provide safety, not to provide liveness. And actually, increasing the threshold reduces liveness of the finality gadget, but it increases safety. So it's a no-brainer. And actually, in this post, I was lying before. It wasn't talking about, so it's talking about 1 round of voting, but not tolerating 20% of Byzantine faults in the finality gadget. It's actually even less. It's 17%. And the reason is because of the notarization threshold and the properties of ebb and flow protocols in order to have basically synchronous safety of the available layer against an adversary controlling 50% of the stake. You need to have a threshold in one round of voting of 83% instead of 80, and that means tolerating a Byzantine adversary controlling at most 70% of the stake. What that means is that there's even the proposal by Vitalik in this tweet is to even go even a bit farther on safety for the finality gadget and a bit, trade in a little bit less of lightness on the finality gadget. But that sounds, to me, that sounds great. That sounds like a fantastic idea, and it should be something that we should be pushing for, and it could be the way to get competing results in latency, even though you have Ethereum has an incredible amount of validators with these other chains that have in the order of hundreds or tens or at most thousands of validators. So yeah, that was all.